So it's good to be back at Friendly Ford again and to have some time with you guys as advisors. You're going to know the answer to this question. The number one service that you guys do on the drive, day in and day out, is what?
Oil change.
Oil change. It's even why Ford has Quick Lane. You know, quickly get them in, quickly get them out. It's the number one. But look here on the board. Not only is it number one for y'all, it's the number one service done in the United States. Last year, there were over 400 million oil changes done on over 270 million cars. Now, there was a day when we did oil every 3 months or 3,000 miles, whichever come first. Obviously, those days are over. Now, on average, I mean, if you just do the math here, on average, the average person is getting their oil changed about 1.6 to 1.7 times per year. So not very often. 3,000 mile oil change is gone. In many cases, a 5,000 mile oil drain interval is gone. 7,500, if you're Toyota or Volkswagen, it's 10,000. If you're some high-end imports, it's as high as 15. I mean, it's nuts how long we're going without changing our oil. And in fact, we think this next statement is painfully true. Whoever gets the oil change business gets all the maintenance business if what? If what? If they ask for it. If we don't ask for it, then we're going to lose it to the competitor. Almost everybody knows from time to time they've got to get an oil change. You know, every 16-year-old boy and girl learn from their mama and daddy every now and then you got to change your oil. Quite frankly, Bob, beyond that, they don't really know what kind of preventive maintenance is necessary. My point being this, there's only one reason in this dealership that you change oil, and it's not to make money, because there's not any money in oil changes. The reason you do oil changes in this dealership is so the technician can get his eyes and hands on the vehicle, do a good multi-point inspection, so you can sell the BG maintenance services, because that's where you make the money, right? Does that make sense? But we got to keep them coming back. We got to keep them coming back, and that's what this service is all about. Now let's look at some trends of the engine. We have smaller crankcases, smaller oil filters. Fellas, I've been around a long time in this business, and I remember an oil filter used to look like a big old fat quart of oil. Today, it's a little bitty teacup. So we have smaller crankcases, smaller oil filters. We have higher performance engine, elevated operating temperature, and in response to that, the OEM says, oh my gosh, we got to change oil more often, right? No. They said, okay, it's a smaller crankcase, smaller oil filter, higher operating temperatures, higher RPMs, ambient temperatures are high, engine temperatures are hotter, and we're going to go longer without changing the oil. I mean, does that seem, there's something wrong with that picture, but that's the way it is. What is the result? Oil oxidation and the additives deplete. Now, this is probably the most important slide I'm going to show you from a personal standpoint, and then the next one will be the most important from a technical standpoint. Look what we're dealing with. Stop and go traffic, idle time. Somebody says, well, I live in rural America. All right, you're pulling a horse trailer. You're pulling hay, you're hauling hay, something like that. And ambient temperature extremes. This year was a classic example of that. Where I live, it was 12 below zero. 7 days later, it was 80 degrees. That is a 92-degree temperature span. Can you say condensation? Can you say stress on the oil? And again, what's the net result of that? Oxidation of the oil, additive depletion. Now, oxidation is a 50-cent word. Just simply means when the oil will no longer do what you want it to do. So really that leads to my next question. And no wrong answers. What do you want oil to do? What do you want engine oil to do? Lubricate parts. That's usually the number one, and I'd agree with you. That's the number one thing I hear, is that boundary lubrication for the parts. But there's also that wet seal, and let me show you what I'm talking about here, the wet seal between the piston ring and the cylinder liner, right? Because we want to keep combustion gases in the top, or up in the combustion chamber, and we want to keep oil down in the bottom, and that wet seal, which is from the oil, is what does that. You don't want the oil to foam, right? You want the oil to keep the seals soft. Again, that 50-cent word oxidation, meaning all those characteristics of the oil, you want them to stay intact. Your most popular weight of oil, what, 5W20, 0W? 520 here at the Ford store. Okay, Bob, kind of a silly question, but if you put in a 520 at the time you change the oil, what do you want the weight of that oil to be when you drain it out? Same thing. If you want it to be a 520, you don't want it to be a 5W30 or a 10W40, something like that. Over mileage and time, that oil wants to thicken up. Or if it gets hot, it might want to turn into water, but it wants to thicken up, so you want it to maintain its viscosity through the drain interval. So there's all of those things it's important that oil do, but you may have hit on the very most important. What did you say when I said, what do you want oil to do? It was the first thing out of your mouth. Lubricate. So let's just take a quick look and see how well your oil lubricates. Now, listen, this is not scientific. This is just a field version of a test that they use in a laboratory environment, and all I'm doing here is painting a picture. But I have a Timken roller mounted in this short arm, just a regular Timken roller bearing, and there's a Timken race mounted here. So I'm dry in my crankcase, or in my cup, if you will. I'm dry, so I'm going to turn on the motor here, and I'm metal to metal, and at 20 foot-pounds, we seize up solid as a rock. Now that doesn't surprise you, right? There is no wet seal between the two. There is no boundary lubrication between the two. When you go metal to metal and that engine eventually goes, eep, that's not a good thing. It's going to be a bad day. So to keep that from happening, we use your 5W20 oil. So this is 5W20. I got this out of your parts department. This is what we might refer to as hydrodynamic action. Hydro because it's, pardon me, hydro because it's a liquid, dynamic because it's moving, but that would be my crankshaft, if you will, down in my oil pan. So, in fact, Chris, if you don't mind, come up here and take a look at this. Watch my... How do you read that?
35.
35, okay. So I was at, and if you don't mind, stay up here for just a second. I was at 25 before. You would expect when I get oil in there that my boundary lubrication, my protection is going to be greater, right? And it is. From 25 foot-pounds to 35. This is BG MOA. And more on this in a minute, but for now let me just say we're talking about installing MOA in every oil change that you do. Not something that you upsell the customer, but just part of every oil change. So what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to add MOA to our crankcase. And if you don't mind monitoring this, okay, what are we at? Is that 25? Okay. Okay, and so 35 is where we seized up with regular oil. What are we at now? 45, 55, 65. Can you tell we're generating a little heat? What are we at? All right. So we went from 25, thanks Chris, we went from 25 up to 65 and no end in sight, and obviously generating a pretty good chunk of heat. So gentlemen, if MOA will do what you've seen it do, can you all see how that would be a must as far as every oil change is concerned? A silly question, but what's that going to do to engine longevity? Extend engine life. What's it going to do to fuel economy? If we have less friction, what does that do to fuel economy, Bob? Absolutely. What about power and performance? How's it going to perform? It's going to increase. And all of that adds up to the ultimate green, because if I increase fuel economy, if I increase efficiency, if I increase power and performance, what does that do to my exhaust emissions? Absolutely. So whether somebody has an issue with pain at the pump, or whether their issue is wanting better power and performance, or whether their issue is to improve the environment, from A to Z, MOA brings that to the table. Now here's what I'm suggesting, that going forward, I'll tell you what, before I do that, let's just say in the past, here was the definition of an oil change. The definition was oil filter and the labor to get her done, right? I'm suggesting, Chris, that we change that definition going forward. Going forward, the definition of an oil change would be this. It would be oil, filter, BGMOA, the labor to get her done, a complete multi-point inspection, and lifetime protection. In other words, a greater value for the oil change to tie them back to our, because they can get an oil change anywhere, but they can't get an oil change like I just described to you anywhere. Does that make sense? In other words, what differentiates your dealership from Goober Lube down the street? The fact that you have a factory-trained technician, you're using OEM oil, OEM filter, you're using BGMOA, you're providing lifetime roadside assistance, a complete multi-point inspection, again done by a factory-trained technician. See how this is starting to sound like value? And the best news of all, Mr. Customer, Bob, you would say it like this, the best news of all is we're going to stand behind your engine for up to $4,000 for life. All you have to do is come back to our dealership and have the oil change with MOA every time you're here. Fair enough? All right, in unpacking this demo, all of you have a machine either that looks like this or the older legacy machines that you have. They both operate exactly the same way. I personally like to leave it on the same spot on the bearing just because it allows me to cut to the chase and it makes this demo a little quicker. If you want to do the dry cut and then if you want to turn the bearing for the oil and then turn it again for the MOA, that's just fine. It'll still work well. I just personally leave it in there just like I showed you. When you do the original cut, I just want a good deep cut in it. Then when I add oil, again, you can't do that wrong. If it seizes up at 20, it'll go to about 30, maybe 25 to 30, possibly 35 with oil, and that's going to be it. When you put the MOA in there, what I would do is move a little bit slower, and that's why I brought Chris up. So you noticed I took a moment to say, okay, we're at 25, and Chris read that. What I'm doing is buying just a little bit of time for MOA to work because it is pressure and heat sensitive. So the more pressure, the more heat, the better it works. Then we took it down to 35, and again, I'm just taking a little bit of time for the MOA to work in. Then we went to 45, 55, 65 in there. And I could tell I was getting a little bit of squeak, but it's not so much about what I'm hearing, it's about the fact that we haven't seized it up yet. So my only advice to you would be, when you put the MOA in, just take it down a little bit slower to give the MOA time to work.